News of a brutal murder is always shocking.
Cordon has gone up around the building. Police said their search was still going on.
He was maybe surprised at the amount of blood that produced.
We know that he's very manipulative and charming.
But when the crime is committed by a cop, it seems even more horrific.
Locals knew the couple had not been getting on, but no one expected anything as vicious as this.
Nobody wants to believe that police officers are criminals.
To die at the hands of the very people sworn to protect us is, for me, the ultimate betrayal of trust.
This man has brought shame on the Met.
He's got a very warped moral compass and probably has some sort of power trip and lust for power.
In his mind, he probably thought, well, I'm a police officer, so I will get away with it.
In this series, I'm going to unravel the outlandish plots, lies and deceit of officers who attempt to get away with murder. The 20th of May 2014 started as a bright and sunny day in Sydney, Australia. But the day would end with the death of 20-year-old student Jamie Gao at the hands of Rogerson and Glen McNamara, two former New South Wales police detectives. This was one of the most documented murders in Australia, carried out by a pair of bent coppers with a long history of criminality. They used decades of police experience and a network of criminal contacts to evade capture, until a critical mistake finally saw them brought to justice. I've brought together a crack team of experts who will help me unravel what happened in this case. Top anti-corruption cop Julie Mackay, psychologist Serena Simmons, and Met homicide detective Howard Groves. With the help of these three authorities on murder, I'm going to try and unravel what happened in this case and how a criminal enterprise that spanned decades was finally brought down. This is a complicated case, so I'm speaking with former Detective Superintendent Julie Mackay, a leading expert on murder investigations.
So we know that on the 20th of May 2014, Jamie Gao goes to a lockup.
Student Jamie Gao thought he was meeting with his friend and business associate, Glen McNamara.
And he's seen going in there. He's seen walking in alive. But he's never seen coming out again.
A search began for Jamie, and videos emerged showing the young student full of life. And now, he had simply vanished. He would never be seen alive again. What do we know about Jamie Gao?
So Jamie was a student. He's only 20 years old, and he's here already, involved in dealing quite significant amounts of drugs, involved with these older men. But Jamie saw his future as a drug dealer and a gangster. His eyes were set on making big money, and that was the route that he was going down. It's just unfortunate for him, he came across Rogerson.
Rogerson was once a celebrated New South Wales cop with a dark side. Now, he was intent on using his criminal contacts to top up his pension. Journalist Duncan McNabb is explaining how, as Jamie's drug dealing escalated, his world was about to collide with Rogerson's, with deadly consequences.
Jamie wants to be a gangster, and he's got this stupid notion in his head, but he's got connections. So Jamie gets himself into a bit of trouble.
Through a network of underworld contacts, Jamie developed a friendship with another former cop turned crook, Glen McNamara.
Glen was just a complete and utter bloody liar and a fantasist, and he got away with it. And he was eking out a reasonable living in Sydney as a private investigator with his reputation for integrity and honesty. But what the truth was is, apart from the fact that he was deeply involved running the scam, he had also idolised Rogerson. And then he and Rogerson had become mates.
But tragically for Jamie, Glen's reasons behind the friendship weren't entirely innocent. Because he had realised there was serious money to be made.
Glen and Jamie keep meeting each other. They actually develop a friendship. It's almost like call me dad, I think, in Glen's case. Glen's a bit of a mentor, and it becomes obvious that Jamie purportedly has connections as well. So they put together a drug deal.
The pair agreed that Jamie would supply $3 million worth of methamphetamine, known as ice, to McNamara. It was a lot for Jamie to get hold of, but with his alleged connections with powerful Chinese triad gangs operating in the area, they could be willing to sponsor the deal for a sizable chunk of the profits.
The plan is coming together slowly for this one day, the day the drugs are delivered and the money's handed over. The storage unit is in place. They've checked where the CCTV is around the place so they won't get pinged. They've done their research. It's on paper, it's a good plan.
But it was a plan Jamie Gao would never see through. Little did Jamie know, Glen McNamara had brought in his good friend and fellow ex-cop Rogerson into the deal. Rogerson, by then over 70, had a fearsome reputation. He and McNamara had no intention of keeping up their end of the bargain with Jamie. But they do arrive at the agreed time, as planned.
The only thing they don't have is the money, nor do they have any intention of bringing it with them. They come with a gun. It's just a cold-blooded, calculated murder of a gullible young drug dealer, a gullible young wannabe gangster. He thought he was dealing with nice old friendly Glen, and he was about to introduce his old mate Roger.
Jamie had obviously turned up at the venue thinking he was just going to be handing over drugs. He wasn't expecting to be ambushed.
So they were waiting for him, knowing that he had drugs, and Jamie was thinking it's a drug deal.
It's something he'd done before. I'm sure he had probably numerous times. He wasn't expecting anything other than that.
Tragically for the wannabe gangster, the drug deal would end in betrayal and murder. Jamie Gao would never be seen alive again. But what exactly had happened to the 20-year-old student? And what had led to his death at the hands of two veteran cops? "20-year-old student Jamie Gao had dreams of getting rich quick. But sadly, he chose a life of drug dealing to make his millions. It was a decision that would cost him his life." On the 20th of May 2014, Jamie went to a storage lockup in the Sydney suburbs to meet with a friend, Glen McNamara, to complete a huge drug deal. Unfortunately, Glen had brought along someone else, a notorious ex-cop turned bad called Rogerson. Jamie was never seen alive again. I want to know more about Rogerson to understand how his presence may have decided Jamie's fate that day in May 2014. And journalist Duncan McNabb has some surprising information. This is a case that has its roots over half a century earlier.
Rogerson was born in 1941 out and grew up in Sydney's western suburbs around Bankstown. Honourable parents, hard-working, good working stock. Roger, mid-teens, decided that he might want to join the New South Wales Police Force. In those days, you could start at the end of your school career and become a cadet. So he's pretty much institutionalised in the New South Wales Police Force from about the age of 16 or 17. And by the mid-60s, Roger was training to be a detective.
Duncan was on the New South Wales Police Force around the time Rogerson was made detective. He recalls there was something about Roger that made him stand out from the other cops, making him a hero on the force.
Rogerson was pretty much the gold standard detective. He's a showman. When he gives evidence in a courtroom in his heyday, He's the sort of man that will make you feel like you're the only person he's talking to. Put him on stage. And that was the Roger magic. He always got convictions. Go to court with Roger as the accused, Roger gives evidence, and you pretty much will be convicted because he was so compelling. Roger was the bloke we always aspired to be. And his superiors saw some significant talent in Roger. He was a very good detective. He was tough, he was pretty fearless, and he was malleable.
But Rogerson's stardom within the force, coupled with the admiration of his peers and superiors, also made him a target.
There were some seriously bent coppers running the show, and these were Roger's mentors. And people like that saw talent in Roger, and Roger slid across to the dark side.
But how could such a rising star be turned so easily? I'm back with Julian Mackay to try and understand how a highly regarded police officer could end up a notorious criminal, mixed up in the murder of Jamie Gao.
So Rogerson's an interesting character. He was in the Australian police and joined in the 1950s. He actually shone as a brilliant detective, and he got a lot of convictions. But if you scratch beneath the surface, there was allegations of bribery.
New South Wales' most infamous cop, Rogerson, appeared to be fraudulently creating confessions and evidence to suit his own agenda.
When you talk about Roger Rogerson being a corrupt cop, what was his corruption sort of based on?
So his corruption was based on being friends with the criminals. Organised crime gangs were his best mates. And then what seems to be happening is he's turning a blind eye to some of their illicit activities, in particular their drug dealing, and he is getting money. And as time goes on, he then becomes involved in the drug dealing himself and is using his position of power to facilitate crime as well as detect crime. He starts to forge his links with effectively his partner in crime, a guy called Glen McNamara, who's a fellow cop. Roger Rogerson and Glen McNamara were basically untouchable as cops in New South Wales. They strutted around as though they owned the place. Even after their careers ended, which was some nearly 40 years later, they continued to associate with criminals.
Dr. Shoham Das is an expert forensic psychiatrist. He's interested in how Rogerson's unique personality traits and early career success set him up to become a famed and powerful criminal, hiding in plain sight.
What I think is interesting about Rogerson's early career was that he was lauded for his work. He was seen as almost a hero-like figure. And I think that might be relevant because it might have fed into his ego and his narcissism, and it might have given him a self-inflated, grandiose self-image. If somebody has a very inflated idea of themselves, it can make them feel almost untouchable, almost like the law and social norms don't apply to them. I think another element can be the actual culture within the police force. So it tends to spread. If there are other corrupt policemen, they often try and recruit their new peers and colleagues into their schemes. Firstly, so that they can make more money overall, but also because they'll be more trusting of colleagues who indulge in the same kind of corrupt activities as they do.
But was this renowned cop turned bad really capable of the ultimate crime, murder? And if so, what led him to the point where his idea of right and wrong became so distorted? To figure that out, we need to look back a few decades.
I think it was in the late 70s when he met a man called Neddy Smith, or Arthur Stanley Smith, I think, to give him his full name. Neddy grew up brutally, was in boys' home from the time he hit double figures. I think one of his first visits to boys' home was for stabbing his brother. By the age of 16, he was running a couple of prostitutes as their pimp in the King's Cross. By his early 20s, he'd been to jail a few times, sexual assaults, robberies, that sort of stuff. Neddy needed someone to give him access to police information and access to people who would look the other way on his criminal enterprises.
That person was Roger Rogerson. Though Rogerson maintained for decades that Neddy was no more than an informer, it is believed that Neddy was a key accomplice, and their relationship marked a major turning point in the officer's switch from hero detective to alleged bent copper. Protecting Neddy would mean huge amounts of money coming Rogerson's way.
Rogerson was, in his early days, a good cop, and I think even at the beginning of his downfall when he met Neddy Smith, he was still a damn good cop.
The alleged dodgy deal between the pair may have initially been profitable, but in 1981, a new player emerged on the scene. Local drug dealer Warren Lanfranch threatened to bring the corrupt scheme crashing down.
Warren was dealing a lot of drugs for Neddy, and Neddy and Roger were getting complaints that they'd been watered down a bit, which is a big no-no. You know, there is integrity in drug dealing, and he decided to also do an armed robbery, which wasn't sanctioned by anyone.
Warren's exploits could ruin everything and draw too much attention to Rogerson and Neddy, which would be a disaster. Something had to be done.
Warren Lanfranchi is summoned to meet with Roger Rogerson. Neddy Smith is a go-between. Warren expresses his enormous misgivings about going to the meeting, but knows he has to go because if he doesn't, business is over.
On the 27th of June 1981, Warren met with renowned police officer Roger Rogerson. Just a few hours later, police are called to the scene. Warren was found with bullet wounds to his chest, indicating he had been shot multiple times at close range. Rogerson claimed he had shot Warren in self-defense.
The police, who then rush to the scene, find that Warren has a gun in his hand. What a surprise.
Questions were raised about Rogerson's involvement, and even Rogerson himself may have realised what a turning point this moment was for him.
He wasn't as clean-cut then as perhaps he thought he was. And I think for him, that was really probably the beginning of the end.
Now, the floodgates opened, and it wouldn't be long before there would be another casualty of Rogerson's seemingly growing power and influence across both the police force and the criminal underworld. During the investigation into Warren's death, someone had dared to challenge Rogerson's recollection of events.
Lynn Woodward had started giving compelling and damaging evidence.
24-year-old Sydney sex worker and friend to Warren Lanfranch, Lynn Woodward, planned to testify that Rogerson had offered to bribe her with drugs to support his version of events. Her evidence would have been crucial to the investigation.
It was supposed to turn up the next day to court, but it is a strong suspicion that she was intercepted that night by Rogerson and Neddy Smith, or people acting on their behalf. She's never been seen since.
With the disappearance of the key prosecution witness, Rogerson was now able to successfully avoid conviction. But the case had changed the public's perception of Rogerson and the force.
The media were becoming a little bit more alert and starting to ask questions about what the New South Wales Police Force were up to. And so the police didn't want their star recruit suddenly becoming a guy that looked like he might be really, really on the outer. So Roger started to become persona non grata.
Rogerson was quickly moved to another department, leaving the media storm to blow over. But far from deterring Rogerson, he gained confidence from these events. Despite being a serving police officer, he had been associated with a drug dealing operation and implicated in a gangland execution. And he'd gotten away with both. Over the following years, he grew even more self-assured and considered himself untouchable. 3 decades later, when he crossed paths with Jamie Gao, the young student and wannabe drug dealer didn't stand a chance. Roger Rogerson became a decorated detective police sergeant and rose to fame by taking on some of the biggest criminal cases in Australia. But behind the hero cop facade lay a dark side. Encouraged by a culture of corruption in the New South Wales Police, Rogerson had nurtured a network of criminal connections and was alleged to have had a key role in a drug dealing operation in the 1970s and 80s. The skills and contacts he developed as a copper would serve him well when in 2014 he brutally murdered student Jamie Gao. The naive student turned wannabe gangster stood no chance against a veteran cop who had already had a history of allegedly eliminating those who stood in his way. In 1981, he was implicated in the suspicious death of drug dealer Warren Lamfranch, and Warren's friends wanted revenge.
Sally Ann Huckstep, a nice Jewish girl from Sydney's eastern suburbs, well-schooled, incredibly bright, got hooked on heroin by a former partner and ended up working as a prostitute in King's Cross.
Sally Ann was Warren's former partner and was convinced Rogerson was to blame for his death. And she was a determined whistleblower, intent on ensuring everyone knew who Rogerson really was.
She continued a very long career saying Roger Rogerson was one of the most evil creatures in Australian history, and she did so in print, she did so on television. She is compelling, smart and brave. She was found face down in a pool in Centennial Park, not far, a couple of k's out of the city. She'd been murdered. Roger Rogerson, curiously enough, had an alibi. He was miles away at a bowling club, although later on his alibi witness was slightly unsure of the date.
We know that Rogerson was a corrupt police officer and he'd committed a number of illegal acts in relation to this. What's interesting is it seems to have escalated. They say that once somebody's taken life on one occasion, it becomes easier on future occasions, and that, I think, is because they become desensitized to all of this emotional turmoil.
By 1984, a decade before murdered student Jamie Gao was even born, Roger Rogerson had lost all sense of his moral compass and would stop at nothing to maintain his double life as a New South Wales detective and a cold-hearted criminal, implicated in drug dealing and corruption. That year, Rogerson discovered that a detective called Michael Drury was due to give evidence in court that would convict one of his criminal contacts. But Rogerson's first loyalty didn't seem to be with his fellow officer or the law, but to the criminal underworld. Drury had to be stopped from taking the stand. When an alleged bribe didn't work, it's believed that Rogerson and his contacts resorted to an old solution that had worked in the past.
They decided that the most effective way to deal with Michael Drury, this pesky police officer, is to shoot him cold-blooded, which Roger knows is on the outer anyway, so I suspect, this is the transition.
The job was given to a drug dealer named Christopher Flannery. But Flannery did not have the skill or the nerve that veteran cop Rogerson possessed, and things didn't go according to plan.
In 1984, Mick Drury is at his kitchen window doing his washing up after dinner, and he's shot by Flannery and survives. Flannery goes into hiding for a few days. Rogerson has an alibi. That's not a bad alibi.
But detectives investigating the crime began to identify links between Rogerson, the shooter, and the intended victim. Rogerson was charged with conspiracy to murder, and it finally seemed that justice was about to catch up with the disgraced copper. But he once again dodged a rap when investigators failed to present sufficiently compelling evidence of his involvement. Despite his implication in another shooting, Rogerson had managed to walk free, and he now set about trying to tidy up loose ends, starting with the inept hitman, Christopher Flannery.
the best way to deal with the pesky hitman is to kill him. And in early May 1985, Christopher Dale Flannery leaves his apartment where he's hiding out and is allegedly goes to the Sydney airport. He's last seen by a cab driver who picks him up. This is the stories abound. He's spotted in Rio, yeah. He's spotted in Europe, yeah. The most likely story is that he was shot.
Though Rogerson denied any involvement, the incident demonstrated that Rogerson's loyalty didn't lie with his fellow officers or his criminal associates. Rogerson was only interested in looking out for number one, something that would cost Jamie Gao his life almost 20 years later. But for now, Rogerson's ego was about to get the better of him.
And he does something really either clever or stupid. I don't been able to work it out. He says on national television that Neddy Smith is a police informant. That one dreadful breach of police regulations gets him booted from the police force. Not the fact that he's been complicit in murders, drug dealing, blah, blah, blah. It's the fact that he outed somebody as an informant on national television. Career over.
Finally, after multiple scandals and narrow escapes, Rogerson's police career ended in 1986.
There's no doubt in the 60s and 70s this corruption was rife, not just in Australia, but all around the world, and certainly in the UK. And really, I think as you get to the 80s is when there's a bit of a turning point and corruption starts to get weeded out.
But the changing tide wasn't a problem for Rogerson.
He just changes sides, so he slips out of the safari suit favoured by detectives and slips into his old windbreaker and jeans and starts doing business around the cross.
After decades as a serving police officer, Rogerson would finally be able to exploit his vast criminal network. Free from the restrictions of actually being on the force, but while still exploiting his contacts. And Glen McNamara would be his all-too-willing accomplice.
They did all sorts of gigs around town. They would do the criminal defence stuff on behalf of solicitors and Crims Direct. They would do debt recovery together, all sorts of businesses around town. And that's how Roger comes into the Jamie Gao case.
Fast forward almost 20 years, and thanks to his alleged links with the Chinese triad gangs and their illicit narcotics trade, young Jamie Gao was now in the same orbit as notorious ex-copper Roger Rogerson. The 20-year-old student was naively entering into a drug deal with a ruthless career criminal. I've asked Duncan to visit the storage lockup where 20-year-old Jamie Gao lost his life, to piece together his last moments.
Both Rogerson and McNamara knew that this place was well covered with CCTV, which you can see it's quite conspicuous. But it was their belief that no one would know they'd actually been here, that the CCTV here on site would be irrelevant because no one would know that they'd actually lured Jamie Gao here.
But despite at least 2 months planning and years of police experience, the pair had made a vital mistake.
This is where the great failing of their plan. They omitted to note that when they met Jamie Gao 900 metres down the road, that meeting had actually been recorded. So police were then able to track their progress camera by camera by camera till they finally got to here, and all the police had to do was come in, speak to the management and get a hold of the footage for that particular day, which showed McNamara and Rogerson outside this storage unit.
Former forensic investigator Alex Izzett has studied the footage used by investigators to find out what happened once Jamie Gao arrived at the storage's lockup on the 20th of May 2014.
We see Gao getting into a car with McNamara. We also see McNamara coming to the storage unit. You see Gao, who was in the back seat, coming out of the car straight into the storage unit.
Jamie's got the bag. Glen allegedly has the money stashed in the storage unit. Then Roger motors back up the street and comes into shot. Now, Roger has what the police describe very politely as a very distinctive gait. He goes in, couple of minutes later, I think they come out. No sign of Gao.
Within minutes of Roger Rogerson turning up, Jamie Gao had been executed.
This isn't the first time Roger had executed a criminal because they were in his way. Warren Lane Franchi was the first. Jamie Gao was the second. Just a cold-blooded removal of a problem.
Despite their initial mistake with the CCTV, when it came to disposing of the body, the pair knew they needed a good cover story.
McNamara goes to his vehicle, takes out a silver surfboard cover, goes back into the storage unit. The next thing we see is somebody pulling up the boot of the car in front, and then if you look very, very closely, there's something being dragged along and put into that boot. And then the car boot gets closed, and then they both drive off.
The plan is to dump Jamie Gao at sea. Cameras at Glen's apartment in Cronulla caught the two men with fishing rods, ostensibly going out in the boat for a day's angling. They got to this boat ramp where they blended in perfectly with the locals, heading up the river to do a bit of fishing, not to dump a body of the person they'd murdered.
Rogerson was acting on his years of experience as a cop.
It's not unreasonable that Roger, thinking that the most dangerous thing in a murder inquiry was to have a body, was to get rid of the body somewhere no one would ever find it. At sea is the perfect location. Glen and McNamara said that the mood on board the boat that morning, as Jamie Gao slipped briefly below the waves, was one of elation.
We know that Rogerson and his colleague planned this murder, then committed it, and yet hours later they were out socialising, they were drinking with their friends or in the pub. To me, this shows a huge lack of fear. They weren't nervous about being caught. They seemed to have almost convinced themselves that they'd gotten away with it.
But unfortunately for Rogerson and McNamara, there would be a twist in the tale. The two highly experienced ex-police officers had for once made a rookie mistake.
A few days later, Jamie's body was found floating on top of the ocean by a poor fisherman who had the misfortune to be motoring by.
The discovery of Jamie Gao's decomposing body changed everything. Detectives now had a trail of clues to follow, but would the pair of corrupt coppers manage to slip the net once again? On the 20th of May 2014, 20-year-old Jamie Gao was brutally killed during a botched drug deal in a deserted industrial estate just outside Sydney. Chief suspects in the killing were corrupt former police officers Roger Rogerson and Glen McNamara. Thanks to their police knowledge and connections, the pair virtually ruled the criminal underworld of Sydney with impunity.
What I think is unbelievable here is that Rogerson was seen as a hero for decades, despite serious allegations that surrounded him.
For the first time, Rogerson was charged with murder. A colossal fall from grace for the cop once hailed as a hero, who had now brought shame to the New South Wales police. Julie Mackay reveals how a new generation of detectives were determined to finally convict the disgraced ex-police officers.
During the investigation into Gao's disappearance and murder, police reviewed a lot of the CCTV, and in particular the CCTV that was centred around the lockup, where he'd obviously gone to meet Rogerson and McNamara. And they could see Rogerson pull up in a car. He had bought himself a Falcon station wagon in the weeks before the murder, and he'd used a false name to get it. So he obviously didn't want it to be linked to him in any way. The reason they knew it was him was because he had such a distinctive gait.
Police used Rogerson's fraudulently obtained car as proof that whatever had happened to Gao was premeditated. He had used a false name in order to cover his tracks, well aware of the crime he was about to commit. But why would a now 73-year-old Rogerson take a gamble on this deal? And why was he so confident he could persuade investigators that he was not involved?
He'd had such a checkered past. He'd committed crime throughout his whole career anyway. He did shoot someone before, so committing really serious crime was no, surprise to him. It wasn't different, it was something he was used to doing, but this guy thought he would get away with it. He was really arrogant, he thought he should be adored, he was a liar. So it was no surprise that maybe he thought he'd get away with this as well.
Though Rogerson had excelled as a corrupt cop, being a criminal mastermind required some different skills and a level of humility Rogerson didn't possess. During the investigation, it quickly transpired that Rogerson's ego had got the better of him, and he and McNamara had made some rookie mistakes.
It's a testament to the ineptitude of these two experienced detectives that when they dumped Jamie Gao's body overboard that morning, they made two fundamental mistakes. First mistake, when a body decomposes in water, it swells up. You perforate the body or stab it to make sure that doesn't happen. The second mistake is they failed to put sufficient weights around the body to make sure it sank. The consequence of that failure was that a few days later, Jamie Gao's body was spotted floating on the surface.
The trial for the murder of Jamie Gao began on the 1st of February 2016 at Sydney Supreme Court.
Throughout the entire trial, the media interest was intense. The public gallery was full of people keen to see Roger Rogerson, a bloke we'd heard of for decades, the most notorious copper in Australia, at the most dramatic criminal trial of his long and very colourful career. This is where it would end.
Alex Izzard, crime scene forensics expert, explains how, from the moment the body of missing Jamie Gao had been discovered, it was only a matter of time before the net closed in on Rogerson and McNamara.
In the autopsy, when Gao was discovered, it suggested that the ballistics, the trajectory of those bullets that went into Gao was that he was sitting down at the time. So whatever happened, he didn't get up, he wasn't defensive, he didn't move forward, he was sat and shot where he was sitting. It's quite difficult for someone standing over a body. If you're struck, you would get up automatically. He didn't have a chance to move. That suggests there wasn't a struggle.
The bullet wounds also suggested Gao had been killed by someone well practiced in assassinations.
There was a double tap, as they call it. It's quite a commonplace gun action. So when you're going to shoot, you shoot to kill, double tap, 2 shots in the same place. It looks like it was premeditated.
But even the most ruthless of executions leaves trace evidence behind.
When you shoot a gun, you are using explosives within the gun to push out the bullet. So when that bullet is pushed out of the barrel of a gun, it comes with it. That residue isn't easy to get rid of, even if you wash your hands a few times, because it's actually occasionally burned into your hand. And if you put it into your pockets, it's obviously going to still be on the barrel of the gun. So that residue can be put wherever the gun's put. When Rogerson's clothing was examined, the police found evidence of residue from the gun in his pants pocket.
The evidence was mounting, and the court would continue to hear how Rogerson and McNamara had left behind a trail of evidence for investigators to follow.
Rogerson being a police officer, you'd have thought that they would have covered the tracks, but they recovered a large quantity of evidence. There was also text messages and telephone call data between McNamara, between the victim, that was also recovered. So quite a lot of evidence, which you'd have thought under normal circumstances, Rogerson would have tried to avoid those things being found. For a police investigation to recover that many items, is not normal. You may get one, you may get the text message, you may get the phone calls, and that's it. You don't then recover the drugs, you don't recover the car, and then you don't also recover, containers for when they were clearing up the scene. Those things just point to one thing, that this was planned, it was premeditated.
Maybe he just thought, they won't even try and look for me.
Arrogance, he thinks he knew it all.
Investigators could then be sure that Jamie had been shot, and then McNamara and Rogerson had stolen the drugs that they had originally agreed to pay him for. Rogerson's defence crumbled. McNamara continued to claim that he had been under the vicious influence and control of the older man. But the jury of 12 found Rogerson and McNamara both guilty of murder. On the 2nd of September 2016, they were sentenced to life imprisonment for their roles in Jamie Gao's death.
When the guilty verdict was handed down, the courtroom was dead quiet. You could literally have heard a pin drop.
After decades of criminality, justice was finally served.
This is the first time Rogerson was convicted of murder after all these years. We know so much about Roger and his exploits, but this coalesced in this one courtroom. We heard everything we needed to know about Roger.
Strange, isn't it? Life in prison, he's going to die in prison.
Of course he is, and that's it. And you're absolutely right, he will die in prison. What a way to end his career.
He's literally gone from the peaks of being this well-revered and award-winning police sergeant to dying in prison.
But along the way, probably one of the most corrupt officers New South Wales Police has ever had.
It was a car crash waiting to happen with Rogerson. He just couldn't stop himself.
He was just a criminal who happened to get into the police, I think.
Rogerson is still charming, still charismatic, he still has it. You always get that glimpse of darkness. The Gao case will always resonate, I think, because it is one of those extraordinary crimes. You can't get it out of your head. Roger has been part of the Australian landscape for the best part of 50 years. Rogerson is one of those characters that will always be with us.
Roger Rogerson thought he was invincible. And he carried out a calculated and cold-blooded murder thinking he would get away with it. The criminal contacts and the police knowledge he collected on the job made him think he was untouchable. Luckily, his corrupt record caught up with him, and he was finally brought to justice.
I would say 99.9% of officers who would have dealt with someone who was corrupt, they'll despise them. That's just the way it is. You never want to be around someone who you know is corrupt. So if you're going to investigate those individuals, you would want to do everything that's humanly possible to prove that they're being corrupt.